This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. After experiencing trauma, I went to therapy, and my therapist guided me through a difficult time in my life. They helped me understand what was happening and provided me with tools to cope and find my own strength and resilience. Their experience and compassion were invaluable and enabled me to rebuild my life and move forward. I strongly believe in the power of therapy to help people through difficult times. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. First, you go to their site. You can use my link, betterhelp.com/resilience. You answer a few questions, and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people with struggles just like yours. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/resilience or choose podcast, then notes on resilience during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month.
If mindfulness is a blocker for you, then let's never use it again. You don't need to. The word is not what matters. As I sort of mentioned around leaders, the goal is not to be a mindful leader. The goal is not to be a mindful friend or spouse or friend. The goal is to be a caring one, a human one. And I think using the phrase intention is a really powerful thing.
Hello, and welcome to Notes on Resilience. I'm your host, Manya Chilinsky. My guest today is Alex Snider. He's a strategy lead with the U.S. federal government and co-founder of Mindful Fed, the first ever government-wide mindfulness community. And we talk today about mindfulness, compassion and leadership, and how to approach mindfulness in the workplace. It's a really eye-opening conversation. I think you're going to enjoy it. Alex, I'm so excited to be talking to you today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, man. This was really fun.
The first question before we dive into the topic is, what is one thing you have done that you never thought you would do?
What a beautiful question. And I love how just in that question, it is this sense of possibility, less than change. I remember jumping on a mindfulness call that we have every week, and there was no facilitator there. They missed the meeting. And I remember just checking in with myself and just saying, I can lead this. Doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be whatever that moment required. And so that moment of not having to prepare for something and to show up and saying, I can provide a supportive mindfulness practice for a couple hundred folks without any preparation. That certainly would have scared me, the living juices out of me before.
Yes, I like that. Just showing up and it doesn't have to be perfect.
Yeah, and if I can add just one thing to that, to really respond to what the moment needed versus I need to show people what a great facilitator I am. So I'm going to write a really great plan and have people be impressed by it. Be able to put my hand up and say, there's a need and I can help meet that need.
Yeah. That's using your mindfulness, being very present in the moment. And I can appreciate that. And I can appreciate that feeling when in the moment you realize you're doing it as well. So that's a very satisfying feeling to, hey, I actually, in my case, hey, I actually know what I'm doing. So we are here to talk about mindfulness and mindfulness at work and in the workplace. This is something you have a lot of experience with. Just to start us off, how does incorporating mindfulness in the workplace contribute to building a culture of compassion and openness?
I think my first answer is it doesn't always. And I think in a lot of my experience, more on the receiving end of sort of a mindfulness training, a program, going to a session, I've seen a lot of the times it really doesn't contribute to a culture of compassion and connection. And what it does instead is it sort of isolates folks. There's a little bit of an opt-in, opt-out culture. So who chooses to go, who doesn't choose to go. Then there's also kind of the the personal struggle with mindfulness. All right, so my company or my workplace hosted like a mindfulness session, a seminar, a little teacher come in and give us the tools and tricks. And then we go back to our inboxes. I go back to sort of a stressful meeting, and maybe I say something I regret, or I make a mistake, or I'm not particularly mindful. And so what happens is instead of this mindful session connecting me a bit more to myself, making me feel more grounded, there's sort of this unsettled feeling of I have the tools, I learned them, but I'm not applying them. And it's my fault.
I think that's such a human response to learn something like mindfulness, as you're saying, and then feel like I'm not doing it right, or there's something wrong with me that I'm not taking in these principles in the right way. I think we do get stuck into that I'm not doing it right piece.
What motivated me to become a mindfulness facilitator, just about 5, 6 years ago now, that I've been leading, was because I was relatively new to the practice. I had only been kind of practicing for 3 or 4 years at that point. And I talked to a bunch of friends about mindfulness, and they would say something to the effect of, "Oh, like, I'm so bad at meditating. I try to sit quietly, and like 6 seconds later, I'm like running through these thoughts and I can't stop." And what I want to say is, you're doing it. Like, you're aware that you're distracted, and you're like, that is mindfulness. It's not this sort of bunk on a hill or the kind of proverbial perfectly blank mind where everything is just tranquil. It's having your mind go to your shopping list, go to wanting to go to Instagram, and then recognizing that the mind is there and it's doing these crazy things. And like part of why I chose this journey is because I wanted to just like give them a hug and say, "You're doing it. Go a little bit easy on yourself."
Yes, I've heard that as well when I've talked about my meditation practice. Oh, I can't meditate because my mind goes everywhere. And I think I don't always say, but I often think the same thing. No, that's okay. That's what it is. But we do have this picture that it's somehow this perfectly blank mind. And again, we focus on, I don't think I'm doing it right. There's a lot of fear of that.
Yeah.
I don't entirely know where that comes from.
I have a hypothesis. I think it comes from a really beautiful place. There's this quality of self improvement, of learning and growth that I've certainly felt in my life ever since I was like a good student in high school and getting good grades and like getting my major in college and having the professors sort of see my learning and growth. And there is a sense of the more effort I put in and the more I strive and I try, I'm going to get better at this. You know, it's something that applies to that, to all the fitness groups, all these sorts of other areas too. And we kind of bring it into this mindfulness space of like, I need to do better. I need to do more. And I think the challenge is the goal is sort of set up as this elusive, impossible thing of the clear mind, as opposed to watching everything and being aware of things. And so it's sort of like maximizing against sort of the and like illusory goal of like stillness and perfectly zen mind in that sort of mindset.
Yes. As you're saying that, I remember I was taking a mindfulness class in back in the day when we left our homes more to do things, and I was late, and I was going to be late, and it was clear that there was no way I was going to arrive before the session started. And the amount of stress I had that I was going to be late was off the charts. And I'm someone who's not generally late for most things, so that also played into it. And it didn't even occur to me until I got there and the instructor was, "This is fine. You're here now. It's all good." How, I don't know, contradictory it was to get so panicked that I was going to be 5 minutes late for a class where I was, or not a class, but a session where I was learning how to be present.
Yeah, it's interesting, man. Yeah, I mean, I think my reaction would be not to say it's contradictory, but it's an illustration of how artificial these boundaries are between what is mindfulness practice and what is not.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the, I'll come back to this example in particular in a second, but it kind of brings to mind, like when you talk about therapy and sort of like what is the therapeutic context. And one of the big parts of that is actually your relationship with the therapist. It's not just like dredging up stories of your childhood. It's actually, how are you feeling about sharing that or being present? And for me, for example, I had all these stories about being late for therapy appointments and what the therapist would think about me and judge me. And that was my own work around how I felt about signals were there. And perhaps that's what's coming up for you. And then specifically with the idea of having this anxiety about being late and showing up in this mindfulness context, like just what you're demonstrating there is your awareness of what's happening in your mind and sort of where this like relational context of what are people going to think about you and what will the teacher think about how you're valuing their offerings. That is itself just as valuable as sitting with your mind and seeing how you relate to writing a shopping list while you want to be counting your breaths.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that way of thinking about it. I didn't feel particularly mindful in the moment. I probably was more than I was willing to admit, but I appreciate your input. You talk about mindfulness at work, and it is entirely a personal thing. It's in our own minds. We do our practice, but how does it relate to being in the workplace, or what is it like to do mindfulness in a work setting?
Well, I do want to spend a moment with kind of the intro to that question of saying mindfulness is a personal thing. I think that's something that's worth exploring for a couple of reasons. I think about when I'm getting ready for a family gathering, how I show up in that setting, being reactive, having unmet needs, wanting people to be a certain way and controlling behavior. What I do with my mindfulness before that setting. Am I finding space to go for a run? Am I taking some stillness and some slowness? Or am I like rushing straight from a stressful workday into that family setting? That has an impact on the family that I'm with. That own sort of like personal sort of practice that I have actually has a huge relational impact.
Mm-hmm.
And then, and I'll get to the workplace in a second, that moment we have with their family and sort of the quality of that connection, the quality of the listening, that's going to go back to how I feel after that setting. So when I leave that family setting and whether I feel activated and stressed and anxious or a sense of joy and peace and calm is based off of what is happening in that family setting. Energies, how much people are paying attention, whether we're able to get into stupid fights about dumb things or able to really see each other and to feel connected and feel that joy of coming back together. I think in a workplace, there's a similar dynamic at place. So the way that I show up before 9 a.m. when I sign into the workday, that affects what happens in those meetings when they go off according to plan, when there's not what I expect happening. How do I respond to that is based on my own personal practice. And then also how those meetings go. If a colleague responds to me with grace and forgiveness for my mistake, if they, highlight some mistake that I did and really rake me over the coals for that, that's going to filter out into the rest of my day, how I treat my family, how I treat that stranger in a coffee shop. And so these boundaries between sort of a personal independent practice and what happens during our workday, I would sort of argue that it's really more of a continuum of how our own personal sense of self and sense of what we're striving for impacts others that we're with, but also how the qualities of joy and happiness and connection that other people are sort of bringing to us, showing us as an example, modeling, help us channel those qualities as well. How does that land for you?
Yes, I see what you're saying. And again, it's the question that you asked when we first got on this call before we hit record, which is how are you showing up today? And I love that question, but as you just explained, that is something in me, but that is also how I relate to the people around me. And in this case, we're talking about the workplace, that affects my colleagues and my team.
Do you mind if I tell you a quick story?
Please do.
So I used to work at the State Department, and I worked sort of in the same office for about 10 years, give and take. And I had this fascinating experience during my farewell. It was over Zoom since it was during the pandemic. And it was this really strange experience where, sort of these farewell things, you sort of, people say nice things about you, then you say nice things about them. And it's a little bit of a weird dance.
That's
What was so interesting about it was when I was going through my list of things that I really appreciate about the office, sort of this quality of generosity and supporting me when I was traveling or out of the office, bringing a sense of humor to work that was actually difficult sometimes, working in pretty dangerous places. Um, Sort of this general like kindness and like really caring about one another more so than just the normal like work day and 9 to 5. Those qualities that I really valued and saw in my colleagues were actually the same ones that they mirrored back and they saw and valued in me. And it was just, being there for long enough to sort of see that growth of the qualities of myself, of finding some play and fun amidst the difficult work. That was something that I brought a little bit based on my own sense of self, my own personality. But it was also cultivated and reinforced and made stronger by the people I worked with.
yeah. Wow. That's a cool story and an important observation. Again, on that same topic of how do we show up affects how people show up for us in that moment. Well, thank you for sharing that. And to think about the workplace, like how can leaders model mindfulness for their teams? Can they?
I'm taking a moment because I'm wondering whether modeling mindfulness is the point.
Okay.
What I think about mindfulness is it's not the goal. Just like the goal of meditation is not to become a good meditator. And the goal isn't necessarily to be more mindful. It's what that allows us to do. And so I think what a leader needs to do is not say, I'm just going to be mindful. I'm going to be mindful. I'm going to be mindful. They need to think about what they're trying to do with that mindfulness. And so one thing I would offer is a role of a leader is to care for their people, to really understand what their needs are, both sort of like physical needs as well, the paycheck and the time off and the sick leave, but also the emotional needs, sort of feeling valued, feeling appreciated, feeling like they're actually contributing to a team. And so for a leader that wants to go and kind of model that to their team, I think what I would offer is you have to start by caring about your team. And like that's the starting point. And that means noticing when they contribute in small ways behind the scenes. And then what mindfulness allows you to say is like, oh, interesting. My colleague went above and beyond. I know it was after hours and they helped me with this thing. It helped me get this project to my boss in time. And what mindfulness allows you to do is to sort of slow down, see that moment, to see the person and actually appreciate them. And one of the things that I've read about before is the definition between recognition and appreciation, where recognition is the simple, like, you did your job, thank you, to actually seeing the person who did that and did it in a certain way, whether that was their creativity or their kind of dedication to it, and really seeing that quality of them that's worth appreciating and valuing versus sort of a generic, I should appreciate you because I'm a boss and we're told we should recognize our employees.
Right.
I sort of sidestepped your question, but I think one more thing I wanted to add, I talked about, you asked like, how can leaders model mindfulness? And I mentioned one idea, which is sort of appreciation, really noticing how people show up and that quality of care. The other is kind of noticing your own mind and your own sort of sense of self. And so, for example, I've been guilty myself of going into meetings when I'm leading a conversation, trying to get to a decision on a certain project or a proposal, and then noticing that there's a quality that I have of wanting to be the leader, wanting to be decisive. And what mindfulness looks like in those settings is being aware of this sense of maybe it's an ego, maybe it's a role that I'm playing, I think I need to embody, and then noticing how that might stand between myself and connection and listening. And so what a mindful leader would do in that context would be to say, okay, I'm noticing that I have this idea. I'm sort of like gripping onto it pretty tightly. It seems like there are people who have different ideas, and I really want to understand what those are. And I'm also noticing a bit of attachment to my idea that I brought in here. And so what you're modeling is sort of this awareness of yourself and an intention to have other voices and other perspectives to really value them and invite them in.
So it's really building a sense of awareness, self-awareness, awareness of what's going on around us. And I say that, I guess, for people for whom the term mindfulness feels a little too woo-woo, because I get that too when I talk about mindfulness and meditation. The response of people who feel, well, I'm more practical, and that is kind of way out there. And it isn't. It's something that we all do at some point in our lives. It's just doing it with intentionality. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, I think naming intention is a really powerful word in this context. One of the frameworks I might offer, and I think you're absolutely right. Like, if mindfulness is a blocker for you, then let's never use it again. You don't need to. The word is not what matters. As I sort of mentioned around leaders, the goal is not to be a mindful leader. The goal is not to be a mindful friend or spouse or friend. The goal is to be a caring one, a human one. And I think using the phrase intention is a really powerful thing. One of the examples I might offer is, I imagine everyone who's listening to this has had the experience of being on cloud nine, of like having good news from work and like watching a really beautiful movie. The weather's perfect. And we have this sense of resilience. Like, the cab driver can be mean to you, your food can be cold, someone can say something kind of cruel to you, and it just water off a duck's back. We all had that experience. And we've also had the experience when we're like really crappy and really tired and exhausted, and someone can like say something that's pretty anodyne, but it feels like a slight to us, and we're so reactive. And so, what I think about mindfulness, whatever you want to call it, what it does is it takes this sense of how we want to show up in our life, the sort of intention of how we want to be. And we all know it: kindness, compassion, forgiveness, generosity. Like, it's in our DNA, it's human. And so it's the gap between how we show up, how we want to show up, and then how we actually do on a daily basis. We're stuck with the small issues, stubbing our toes and having a rainy day when we were hoping to have a picnic, and also the more challenging ones, whether that's, so that could be, an election loss, that could be something like the death in the family, that could be a more difficult situation at work or interpersonally, a breakup. And so when you have those really challenging things to deal with, what mindfulness does, and that can also be self-awareness or other things, it helps narrow that gap between how we want to show up in that ideal situation and how we actually can on a daily basis when we're stuck with the challenges of life.
I like thinking of it that way, that closing the gap between how we want to show up and how we do show up. Alex, we're getting close to the end of our time. What is giving you hope these days?
What feels alive for me is there's such an existential sort of focus in a lot of our world of like the election, all these difficult things. And what's giving me hope is just this human thirst to connect. And I've seen that. I was at a running group this morning, and I was imagining these 30 people could have gone on a run by themselves on this kind of cold Friday morning. And it would have been a totally different experience than what it was like running together, running as a group. And so I think this moment, if it does anything, drives us more towards each other and reminds us that, yeah, we can do things alone, including mindfulness, including meditation. But also, like, when we do it together, when we share this experience with other people, it's just a much different one and a much richer one. And so I think this human thirst to connect on just a very individual human basis, like, that is something that does give me hope.
Oh, that's a lovely thought. Thank you for sharing that. And before we wrap up, tell our listeners How can they learn more about you, read more of your writing?
Part of what I get excited about with writing is thinking about writing as something to explore together. It's kind of a topic that people can go and read an article and then react to it, and sort of treat as something to experience together with other people. And so that's why I started writing. And so I have a Substack. Human Bureaucracy is where you can find most of my writing. I also write for Psychology Today, but I link to all those things on my Substack. So that's the best way to find me. And feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, or other places. We'd love to connect.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thanks, Manuel.
Thank you for listening. I'm Manya Chilinsky. I help organizations analyze their culture, focusing on building environments where well-being and resilience can thrive. Through this process, we identify areas for growth, develop strategies, and create the necessary changes to build healthier, more supportive organizations. If you're ready to make a change, I'd love to connect. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or your listening platform of choice. It really helps others find us. And if you want to continue the conversation, connect with me on LinkedIn or visit my website, www.manyachilinsky.com. Thank you for being part of this journey with me.